Most youth ministry podcasts are made by youth leaders and used to share their ideas on how to engage with the next generation of youth ministry.
But here at the Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church, we're going straight to young people themselves to find out what they want from the church.
Like the prophets of the Bible, it is our hope that the voices of our young people will help inspire the church to better adapt to serve the now generation.
This is Mountain Sky Prophets. My name is Courtney Von Lindern, and I am the designer of Next Gen and Inclusiveness Ministries for the Mountain Sky Conference.
And I'm Amanda Daniel. I'm the coordinator for Young People's Ministry and Camping Ministry for the Mountain Sky Conference.
And today on Mountain Sky Prophets, we are spending some time with Isaac. And Isaac, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me here. I'm Isaac. I live in Montana and I just turned 16 a little while ago. I've been confirmed in the church. I was baptized in the church. And that's pretty much all you have to know about me right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Isaac. Happy belated birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for being here with us and for being our first guest here on Mountain Sky Prophets. So just to kind of get us going and introduce our conversation a little bit, what do you think is the biggest challenge that's facing your generation? So you just turned 16, you're a 16-year-old teenager living in today's world. What's that like for you?
I think the biggest challenge, and this is, completely a secular issue, but if I'm being honest, climate change is what scares me the most. And that's a different topic than largely what we'll be discussing here today. But I think when you look at it as an overarching existential issue, there's a lot of comparisons that you can find in the Bible and that you can find taught in religion too, that could link it back to the church and how we want to approach it, community wise and societal, from a societal perspective, I guess. But I think overall, that's the issue that I think is the most concerning for youth at this point.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would have never guessed you would have said climate change. Is there anything you think that the church should be doing to address climate change?
I think on a minimal scale, we could address, our sustainability and our consumption of unclean electricity and things like that. I think on more of a cultural scale, we can look at how we are contributing socially and communications wise to this issue and what we can be doing better to include people in conversations about this, because it on one level is affecting people environmentally and things like that, but it's also affecting people in their way of life, and that could be detrimental to their spirituality and their social life as well, and how they thrive as humans, which is one of my biggest concerns.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Isaac. In my time with young people such as yourself, that seems to be a common topic that keeps coming up. And I know that some churches are addressing, kind of that sustainability question of how can we help be a part of this solution in context of climate change. And I know some of us are also still a little bit behind in those conversations as well. So in thinking about climate change and that kind of being a big challenge for your generation, what does that feel like for you on an individual level? What are some of the feelings that might come up with that?
On an individual level, it's terrifying, and it can be disheartening even at times, looking at the kind of lack of action that we're seeing. There should be a lot of proactivity and a lot of involvement from different bodies in our society that should be making some major steps here to prevent this as a catastrophe. But at the same time, there's been a lot of youth movement, and it's been driven by my generation to address this, and that does keep this lingering feeling of hope that we're going to get something done. and be able to fix this to protect the earth and protect the people on it. So it's a lot of mixed feelings, and I can only leave it at that. But I think it covers the negative and the positive that a lot of young people are feeling when they see this.
Yeah, I'm inspired by your generation, honestly, in being able to engage in this kind of work, in this conversation. And I know that I'm sure it might feel like sometimes the burden is kind of on the shoulder of your generation as you inherit, the mistakes of my generation and other generations as well. And um, I definitely feel pushed by you all to do better, and I think about that often. And so, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, just the work that everyone in your generation does definitely gives me hope, and it's encouraging to see that there's not just a total line of hopelessness in it. But I know in working in climate change that is something that comes up. It is big, it is scary. There's a lot going on and a lot happening. So thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable with that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that gets overlooked or something we don't discuss enough. So
Mhm.
it's definitely something I'd like to dive more into with young people. So thank you.
So on the note of that too, Isaac, since you brought it up, and we're just going to stick with it for a little while, if that's okay with you. Do you feel like your church context are having conversations about climate change where you are, or even in your youth group if you're engaged with one?
I would just go right out and say, no, I've never had a conversation regarding climate change in any church setting. Um, but, expanding on that note, I personally think, and this is something that's just going to be developed in coming years, to keep people engaged in church and stuff like that. But like I said a little earlier, there's so much within, the Bible and spirituality that can be linked to these social justice issues. And I think our mission as Christians is to be on the front lines of these social justice issues, and we already try to show that going in mission constantly as much as we can and doing all that we can. But I think the conversation does need to shift a little bit and be adjusted to, some of the things we're experiencing more so in the 21st century than have ever been experienced before. And that's through sermons, that's through other ministry, that's through youth events, but that's for every generation, in my opinion.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up how the church engages with social justice issues of the 21st century and especially modern day. I think sometimes we do fall short in being able to engage with what's going on in the world. And I'm curious, in your experience and kind of with people in your area and friends your age and things like that, do you feel like, or let me back up right quick. Do most of your friends like attend church or not?
I think in my circle of sorts, there's a lot of diversity in religion, but I mean, as far as Montana goes, I'd say it's more between different denominations. But I have Mormon friends, I have Catholic friends, of course, I have Methodist friends. But still, with that, the majority of my friends don't regularly attend any church. And I think there's just a disconnect in the messaging for sure. I mean, some of them are atheists, some of them are agnostic, and they probably don't want to go to church ever. But a lot of people, I think, are just not going to church who are my age because they just aren't feeling that connection or, a purpose with the messaging that's being put out by the church, just because overall it doesn't quite have a source from our generation either. Because I feel like our voices are being left out of these conversations. And so, as much wisdom as there is from older generations, that's not always going to connect well to younger generations. And that could be one of the issues for sure.
So it's almost kind of like there's a bit of a disconnect, right,
Hmm.
between younger generations and older generations. Like, what do you think the solution to that is in talking about social justice issues? And obviously there's a lot of diversity in beliefs and spiritualities, right? And I know sometimes for young people, church is dependent on whether or not their parents are going. That's not always the case
Mhm.
necessarily. So to kind of put a bunch of questions into one to throw them at you, do you think that the lack of connection to like modern day issues like social justice issues, climate change, things like that, do you think that is missing from conversation in your churches? And then also, if there's a disconnect between older generations and younger generations, what would that solution look like to kind of bridge that gap?
To answer your first question, I'd say yes, as a short answer. And I think rather than thinking about, take a sermon, for example, a topic of social justice being something that's just more interesting to youth, I think it's a reality to youth and it has to be addressed as that because it's not something that's just going to pull people into church for the fact that, hey, I want to hear these words regarding LGBTQ issues in the church, Black Lives Matter, as it's related to the church. But it's not that, it's the fact that it is our lived experience as young people, and that's what church should be tackling and should be covering. It should be covering every generation's lived experience, but it's definitely lacking in probably millennials and Gen Z and whatever generation is below us too, but they're a little too young to be concerned about that. But yeah, to answer your first question, yes, I think that really is a major factor. And the solution, I think the solution to this is just to, shift ministry to include discussion of these topics and to not only leave it at that, as in like a meeting between young people and clergy, something like that, but really taking what is learned and exchanged in those areas and using them for all types of ministry, especially sermons, in this era, digital communications to try to get people in. And, I think that as a baseline, we just need to kind of shift how we're approaching, sorry, I lost my words. I think we need to just kind of change the baseline of what church has been for a while. And of course, the Bible is incredibly important. And of course, we have all these beautiful traditions and everything like that. But the Bible is in my opinion, a living document and it can be interpreted millions of ways by billions of people. And I think there's a lot of new interpretations of these stories that can contribute to this solution for sure.
Yeah, I think including young voices is something we're not doing very well right now in the church. And we need to do better. And it's so much easier said than done
Mhm,
because I mean, how often do we hear folks say we need young people,
mhm.
but we're still excluding the young voices. And I don't necessarily know what the best solution is for that, but
Yeah, I hear you, Amanda and Isaac, as well. Yeah, we're always asking, younger people to come into our churches, come join our worship, come do all these things. And I think sometimes when we open that invitation, we kind of want them, I'm speaking for myself as well, but we want them on our terms. Like, oh, like I want the youth to come in and I want our church to like youthful. I want to see the future of my church. Like I want to know that when I'm gone, in whatever capacity that may be, that there's a legacy of sorts, right? Like there's like this next generation coming in, but I think especially as we're engaging younger generations, and I don't think that this is unique to our time. I have a feeling that if
Mhm.
we talk to older generations, this is a common thing, right? Like we're always looking to the younger generation of, oh, you're too young or you don't know what you're talking about. But at the same time, if we're looking at how to maintain and call in the future of the church, we have to realize the fact that this generation is now. Like you're here, you're growing up in our communities, you're um, participating in various activities and groups, whether that's at school that's involved in the community, whether that's in church, whether that's other clubs and activities, or organizations that you're starting. Isaac, I know that you've helped
Mhm.
kickstart Montana Youth Action here in Montana, which is super rad. And so when we think of like, oh, we want more young people in our church, well, that's great, but how are we catering to them? And I think sometimes even youth ministry is more difficult in today's day and age when we're competing with so many different organizations and different recreational activities that young people have available, which I think is phenomenal to have. But we have to begin to consider, if we're inviting these young people into our spaces, how are we not just welcoming you, but including you in our leadership, in our worship, in our various opportunities, and being open to, as you mentioned, just reimagining the baseline of church and reimagining our scripture and the Bible. I really appreciate how you said that the Bible is kind of like a living document, because I think that's so true. I mean, if it's existed for thousands of years and it has stood for this long, that has to be saying something, right? Like, it's still meaningful to us today. And so if we continue to interpret it into our current generations and what that looks like and how it applies to what's going on in our world right now, yeah, we can totally recreate that baseline.
Yeah, I often wonder, and a lot of feedback I've gotten from other young folks is they're not being spiritually fed at church anymore. And like you said, Courtney, there's so many other organizations and activities that we can do outside of church that do feed us in different ways, that we go to rather than go to church. And Isaac, I don't know how you, at the church you attend, if you feel spiritually fed through your youth group.
I would say that overall, as my own needs for spirituality have changed in the past years, and how my perspective and relationships with religion have changed in the past few years, I'd say a lot of things that have worked for me spiritually in the past, but don't necessarily give me that same energy now, just feel stagnant and they feel like a problem unaddressed. And I appreciate so many of the ongoing traditions and practices of my church. And I'm not talking about, something like communion necessarily, but Holy Humor Sunday or something fun like that. As much as I love communion too, don't get me wrong. But I feel like there hasn't been much change, and it just feels like some things that could be easily addressed or not so easily addressed either way, but need to be addressed in some way, haven't even been, taken out of the box yet. And they're just kind of gathering dust in the back. That's a very deep metaphor, yes. But yeah, I feel like some things just are being ignored and some things do need to go, and that's inevitable, and they need to be replaced with newer, more, spiritually drawing things for young people.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about your metaphor, the, you know, things ignored in the back, covered in dust. And that idea of like letting some things go or like pushing things to the side. Because I see that a lot in various church contexts as well. And I remember growing up in the church and, kind of witnessing people have these conversations about things that we need to do and things that need to change. And then it just kind of sits in the back and collects dust and maybe nothing really changes. I see it as like a potential fear factor, and I'm curious how you might see it, if you see maybe a fear of letting go for folks or kind of what is hiding there. And then on the other side of that, if you think folks are afraid, because if you disagree with me, please tell me. But if you think folks are afraid of letting go or afraid of change, what would you say to help them like release that fear, so to speak?
Well, I would first of all just agree 100% that there is a fear from older generations, and I think across, different institutions in society, not just the church, but in politics and education and whatever else that does concern youth, it's abnormal for youth to actually be heard and for that to actually be taken and applied to anything. And as much as some different bodies, for example, if you do look at politics, which is something that I'm personally involved in, yeah, a lot of elected officials, not a lot, actually, that's an overstatement. Some elected officials will take the time to sit down with you, but it's a much smaller percentage of elected officials who will actually take what they learned and apply that and make some meaningful change that actually encourages youth to be civically engaged and whatnot. And if you look at that model for the church, I don't think the issue is things not being taken and applied. I think the issue is we're not even quite to the spot where we're sitting down yet to have that exchange. So I think as soon as we get to that point, that will be when we can actually start making some progress and taking those new ideas and implementing them into our different areas of ministry and programs and such. But if you could repeat your original question, I'll link it to there. Sorry, I went a little off track.
No, that's totally fine. And I think it, yeah, began to answer that question of like fear of change. And yeah, like what would you say to someone in the church or to a group or a committee in the church who was afraid of sitting down with young people even and taking your concerns seriously, or even if they were afraid to like start making the changes that maybe you might need to see happen?
Mhm,
Well, because what's the phrase we hear all the time? That's not how we do it.
mhm. It's hard to identify someone who's afraid. You will be more likely to see pride or anger or disgust with, change. I think what I would have to tell someone if they were really so vehemently opposed to some significant changes in the church, I would ask them if they would prefer going to church 1,000 years ago, or if they would prefer going to church 100 years ago, and ask them if the church has been the same all that time. Ask them if no one took some big steps and made some changes, positive changes, in my personal opinion, that have made church more accessible, that have made church more enjoyable, that have made church more welcoming and open and effective in our lives. Because based on my AP European history class that I took last year, church was not anything like it is today, and it was not something that's opening to all people at all. It was far from that. So the point is, we've been changing forever, and maybe we haven't been changing recently, but it's always been changing. So why should it be different now? And just ask them to put themselves in our shoes in that regard, and see, would you like to see this change or would you not like to see this change? Because this change has to happen, or the church is going to change on its own out of our control, and that's not something that we want to see either.
Right.
Yeah.
Change is so hard for some reason, right? We see that especially in our churches. And I don't know if maybe it's a little bit of control. Folks can control some things, and if you change it, then they can't. But it's definitely inevitable and something we have to embrace.
Yeah, I appreciate Isaac, you bringing that into question too, that idea of, well, would we attend church like 1,000 years ago? We've always been changing. And then Amanda, as you mentioned, like that change is really hard and really difficult. And sometimes I like to wonder in a spiritual context of, when we're asking God for guidance in all of this, or asking the Spirit to make its presence known and lead the way, oftentimes I think God puts us in really uncomfortable positions to make change, right? Like, I can't think of any time that God's ever asked me to do something easy. I've always been very resistant to the voice of the Spirit, so to speak. And I think sometimes we see that in churches. It's very, very easy to get comfortable, not just in church, but in our normal everyday lives. And I think COVID-19 definitely kind of tore that box open for everyone. We were comfortable in our daily routines, and then that was suddenly disrupted. And I think a lot of churches, especially in our conference area, have been looking at ways to move to an online platform, and kind of just got forced to do so right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so sometimes we have the time and the energy to prep for change, right? So we can sit down and have these conversations, and we can be really active in moving forward with something. And then other times we just don't have a choice. God shows up and says, "You're doing it. Like, we're out of time. This is what's happening." And so, yeah, I appreciate kind of your insight there on looking back at what church used to be, and if that's something that we would still connect to, because I'd imagine that a lot of people would say probably not, and I'm sure growing up had their own frustrations in the church as well. And but I can also think of maybe possible examples where some things are hard to let go just out of tradition or nostalgia or family connections and things like that.
Hmm.
But
No, I just wanted to add even, and this tangible part is not completely applicable, but 500 years ago, you were forced to go to church, and if you didn't go to church, you'd be burned at the stake. And if you didn't go to Catholic church, you would also face some sort of punishment. So just like, you know, if you look at like the Reformation and everything, that was like one of the biggest spiritual reforms in all of history. That's literally what it's called, a Reformation. And I mean, what we'd be changing in the church is nothing near to a reformation of the church, but it's a shift, and it's a big shift. It's not like it's unattainable, the change, because we look at historically, things have been significant and huge, and they've worked. And now we have tons of denominations and a beautiful diversity of practice within the church. And I think that's, to some sense, what is just going to be happening now. It's just going to, you know, change our practices and expand them and make them more inclusive to different generations and different demographics. And I think that's, the goal of change on every front in every area of society too, for the most part.
thanks for that, Isaac, and yeah, for bringing in the Reformation. Like you're right, that was a huge shift in church. It helped set up what we have today in our church and ministry context and our denominations all over the world. So I'm curious then, since we've been kind of beating up church a little bit, so we can, I don't know,
Mhm,
give it a break for a minute. What do you think church is doing well? What do you enjoy about being engaged with your church community?
My favorite part of church is definitely fellowship. And I think, if anything, there can never be too much fellowship. And that's the most difficult thing to do in the midst of a pandemic. But I think that building up community in church is super important. And I've seen aspects of that been very successful in my church. And I think efforts to, and most churches do this, but fellowship every Sunday between church snacks, sit down with your pals, going on ski trips, going to the lake. And we're seeing less of that now due to the pandemic, obviously. But I feel like meeting God in different ways, in different places, but doing it together has always been, a really strong part of the church to me. And it's something that I'd love to see more of too.
I'm all for fellowship and more church snacks. Those are definitely some of my fondest memories in church growing
Hmm.
up and now, so to speak.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Fellowship is I think one of the number one things the church does well, and it I think a lot of times that's why people come to church is to be with their friends and
Hmm.
eat snacks. Um, I grew up in Texas, and you didn't go to Sunday church without donuts. So you'd have an uprising if you tried to change that.
Church snacks are basically just reimagined communion, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Isaac, last big church related question for you. What do you think the mission of the church is in modern 21st century?
That is a big church question. I'll give you that. I would like to take one section again from our, I believe it's the official slogan of the United Methodist Church, but I think going in mission for good should be and should always be the focus of the church. And I think going in mission means a lot of different things, and it always has. And it means big things and little things, from disaster relief to volunteering to helping out a friend who's going through a difficult time. Going in mission can mean a lot of different things to different people. But I think we just have to take that to heart and take it really seriously, that God put us on earth in order to help other people and to be tenders of this beautiful garden that he created for us. And I think if we step away from that and ever ignore that, then the reason for church is going to be somewhat lost. But I think that if you look at things like social justice issues, and you look at things like addressing climate change on a personal level and a community level, and you look at things like assisting your neighbor and loving your neighbor, whoever your neighbor is, they don't have to live next to you, but anyone that you see who needs your help. I think as long as the focus of church stays on that, and even has an even greater emphasis on that going into the next few decades, especially with everything so existential and painful going on around us, I think that should be our mission, and that'll help keep the church together and on the right track.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Isaac. And before we head out and sign off, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share any of your favorite scripture or Bible stories with our listeners today.
I think the Good Samaritan is highly applicable within this conversation and for everyone in these trying times. But I think, especially for older and aging generations, you look at the moral of the Good Samaritan, it's someone who was not expected to be helping someone of a different social arena than he, someone who kind of stepped out of the norm, someone who would not even be applauded for doing this good act, but maybe even cursed or something like that by his peers. But I think what that means in a modern sense is stepping out of your comfort zone, having uncomfortable conversations, and even literally doing exactly what is in the story and reaching out to a neighbor that you wouldn't reach out to before. And whether or not that's you reaching out to a neighbor of a different race or ethnicity than you, a different sexual orientation or gender identity than you, even if before you've had some reservations with different types of people, and you've been taught that different types of people are sinners or unfit for attending your church. I think now more than ever is the time to rethink any and all of those hurtful ideologies that are holding us back as a community. And I would just suggest that everyone opens up their Bible and reads the Good Samaritan story, and using something so quintessential in the Bible as loving your neighbor and finding a way to really apply that right now.
Thank you, Isaac, for reminding us of the Good Samaritan story. I agree. I think it's so important and applicable to modern day. And thank you also for inviting us to rethink a lot of the ideology. And Amanda, do you have any last questions for Isaac before we wrap this up?
I don't think so, Isaac, but thank you. You've certainly given me a lot to ponder and think about.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, of course.
I look forward to working with you more moving forward on some of these issues.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for being here, and thanks everybody for listening. And once again, I'm Courtney Von Linder.
And I'm Amanda Daniel.
Thank you, Isaac, for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Parable of the Good Samaritan, from the book of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who was my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said. 'When I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Thanks for listening to the Mountain Sky Prophets. Mountain Sky Prophets is brought to you by Young People's Ministries and Next Gen and Inclusiveness Ministries of the Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church. You can find us at www.mtnskyumc.org. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure you tell your friends to listen in too.